And Tammy was largely responsible for the design and implementation of the health and body composition trial, one of the most productive, important longitudinal trials examining changes as they predict function ever been conducted. So we're really honored and pleased to have Tammy here to talk about sarcopenia and frailty.
Well, thank you for the very lovely introduction, and thank the organizers for inviting me to come and speak today. They asked me, my topic was assigned as sarcopenia to frailty, and I decided to take the organizers at their word and use the Health ABC data to go on and take a look at sarcopenia and frailty. So, so there were basically three things I was going to talk about. This is an overview, examine the transition from sarcopenia to frailty, and the ideas that I have are that sarcopenia will be associated with risk of frailty, would contribute equally, and so any of the things that have been outlined, like low grip or low strength or low gait speed, would contribute equally. And then to go on to examine the initial risk factors and see how they relate to the two different concepts of sarcopenia and frailty over time. So sarcopenia and frailty, I thought, would have similar risk factors. Risk factors would have similar strength of association, and they'll be in similar direction of effect. And then just talk a little bit about where this all leads. So the data that I'm going to be using is from the Health Aging and Body Composition study. And many of you know this study, but I'll just go over it briefly. The idea behind this study was that change in body composition is a common pathway by which weight-related health conditions in particular contribute to risk of disease and disability. We enrolled 3,075 men and women who were initially aged between 70 and 79, and 42% were African American. We started the study in 1997, 98. In Memphis, Tennessee, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, two cities in the United States, funded through 15 years of follow-up, and we hope to bring the remaining survivors in for a last examination in the following year. The primary outcome in the study was incident difficulty walking a quarter of a mile or 10 steps that persisted over a period of 6 months. So at baseline then, everyone had to report to us twice that they were able to walk a quarter of a mile without difficulty and able to walk up 10 steps without difficulty. And this is a diagram that I took a long time ago from Dr. Bellis and have used for multiple illustrations. But in this case, really what we're talking about are people who start off at the relative zenith of their health and then cross the line of sarcopenia here at year 6 of Health ABC, and then at year 10, to look at who progresses from sarcopenia to frailty, and then to look at the risk factors from the baseline as they relate to sarcopenia and to frailty. So this is the scheme from the European Working Group article, and this is using Health ABC Year 6 data. There were 1,694 people who had all the necessary information. They split on gait speed, and here I use the gait speed of less than 1 minute just to allow me to have slightly larger numbers to work with. So about 32% of the people had a gait speed of less than 1 meter per second. This group went down the grip strength categorization. The men were less than 30, the women less than 20. Again, about 22% were low. You can see a substantial number of people then fell into the no sarcopenia group. This group bounced up to the measure of the muscle mass. These are the criterion that I used based on appendicular lean over height squared. And you'll see that basically out of this, out of the population of people who went down this arm is 30%, and it came to 14% of the population, or 235 people, had sarcopenia out of the population of 1,694. Now for frailty, I use the Linda Free definition. Grip strength, some of these I was a little more liberal with, again, so that I had reasonable numbers to work with. Lowest sex-specific quartile, walking speed, lowest sex-specific quartile. You can see in the men that was 0.86 and the women 0.78. Weight loss of greater or equal to 4.5 kilograms. from reported weight 2 years prior. That was about 16% of the people. The 2 items from the CESD scale, 10%. And then for physical inactivity, these were people who reported no walking at all for exercise or stair climbing. So the frailty prevalence based on a score of 3 or more was 8%. And the results that I'm going to show you are similar, even if I lower the score a little bit so that I have 24% of people who were considered frail. So the first question was, does sarcopenia in year 6 predict frailty in year 10? And it turns out that, in fact, sarcopenia does predict frailty with a relative risk of about 2 and a confidence interval that indicates statistical significance. But if we look at each of the variables that created the sarcopenia measure, low gait speed is associated with frailty all along the line. Low grip is associated with frailty. Low mass, not at all. If I put low speed and low grip in the model, both predicted frailty. But, and if I put low speed and low mass in the model, low mass did not predict frailty. If I put low grip in the model and low mass, only low grip predicted frailty. And if I put all 3 in the model, again, low mass fell out. So of the 3 criteria that we're using to create the sarcopenia model, the low mass is really not adding anything when we look ahead at predicting frailty. Okay, so in summary then, examining the transition from sarcopenia to frailty, I thought that sarcopenia would be associated with risk of frailty, and in fact it was. And I thought that all components of sarcopenia would contribute equally. And low speed and low strength both predict frailty, but low lean mass was not associated with risk of frailty. Okay, so let's go on to the second set of questions. So I examined baseline risk factors from the start of the study in relationship to sarcopenia and in relationship to frailty, and thought that they would have similar risk factors with similar strength of association, and they would have similar directions of effect. So these are some of the characteristics from baseline, and this is the, I'm going to show 3 tables that are basically the same. The measure is here. These are the characteristics from baseline. So this just shows you that the percent male is about 47% at both time points. The percent white was about 66%. The mean age was about 73.2 at baseline. The mean BMI was 27.2. So really these outcomes, at baseline, these people look pretty much the same. Okay, so if we look at demographic characteristics now, these tables, there are 3 tables that are very similar. So these are the baseline measures. It's as they predict sarcopenia and as they predict frailty at year 10. So older age was associated both with risk of sarcopenia and with risk of frailty. And the direction was consistent, that is, older people were at higher risk for both sarcopenia and for frailty. We look at race, we see something similar. Blacks were at higher risk than whites. The results were consistent. If we look at gender, however, we see that gender predicted sarcopenia and women had more than men, but we don't see any association with frailty. And if we look at site in our study, our site that has a higher mortality rate has a higher risk of frailty at year 10, but there was no association at year 6. Then looking at some measures of function and morbidity, if we look at lower leg strength is consistently associated both with sarcopenia and with frailty. However, other measures of morbidity differ. For instance, we have a measure from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid. We have the number of days that people were hospitalized before the study started. And it turns out that that does not predict sarcopenia at all. However, 10 years later, it predicts frailty. If we look at the number of major diseases that people have at baseline, it doesn't predict sarcopenia, but it does predict frailty. If we look at pack years of smoking as a baseline, not sarcopenia, definitely frailty. If we look at diabetes risk, even though a measure of lean mass is included in this. It was not associated with the sarcopenia measure. However, it was associated with increased risk of frailty. The most surprising findings had to do with the body composition measures. So if we look at these body composition measures at baseline and how they predict sarcopenia and frailty, we see that body mass index is associated inversely, so that lower body mass index is associated with sarcopenia, whereas for frailty, heavier body mass index predicted frailty. If we look at percent fat, all these measures basically then follow from this association with body mass index. Lower body fat, lower appendicular lean, lower thigh muscle from CT, all predicted sarcopenia, whereas greater percent fat and greater lean mass, which go along with heavier BMI, predicted frailty. So the direction of prediction is opposite for sarcopenia and for frailty. If we look at thigh muscle attenuation, which is a measure of fatty infiltration into the muscle, less fat is worse here. That is, just exactly as Dr. Morley suggested a few minutes ago, and here more fat is associated with a higher risk of frailty. So examining the baseline risk factors for sarcopenia and frailty, sarcopenia and frailty have some similar risk factors. Some risk factors are shared, but others are different. The risk factors will have a similar strength of association, was my prediction. And in fact, it's a very mixed picture, especially for measures of morbidity and for body composition. And risk factors will have similar direction of effect, and the body composition measures in particular are opposite. So what this suggests then is in Health ABC, and I believe this is what Dr. Morley suggested earlier, that sarcopenia and frailty are two distinct entities that share some common features and risk factors, but really are distinct. The body composition measures are particularly revealing. Lower body mass index is associated with sarcopenia, and lower lean mass as part of the sarcopenia measure did not predict frailty. Heavier BMI 10 years earlier is associated with frailty. And I think that we need to ask ourselves what role the muscle is really playing here, at least in this population. I think that the muscle mass, I don't mean to imply that muscle mass is not important, it's critically important in all the ways that we've heard people talk about cachexia today. But I think that the issue for cachexia and the issue for those of us who might be interested in function in old age may be very different. And I think that the term sarcopenia may have led to a certain amount of confusion in terms of what's important to focus on. So should we focus on strength and function rather than on muscle per se? So this leads me to a suggestion as one way of also dealing with the question of what's important. That I think that we can think about new measures that would capture function in everyday life. And one thing that we've been looking at is use of accelerometry, not as a measure of physical activity, but to help us understand objective measure of daily activity with sensors that may offer weight, capture function in everyday life. And the question is, could this be used to track function and identify effective interventions? And I'm not saying this is the solution, but I think that we should be thinking more along lines like this of new technologies that might be augment the way that we're thinking about these things. And I'm just going to show you two graphs which come from the NHANES accelerometry data. So these are counts per minute. Counts per minute are just indicators of activity and the intensity of activity. These are very low level intensity movements. So even though the graph comes up to 300 and tops out here, 300 is extremely low. 100 is the cutoff that's been suggested for completely sedentary. But you can see that we've divided people into the no disability group, those people who have mobility disability, and those people who have ADL disability. Here we have people who are age 80 plus. Again, we have the no disability group, the mobility disability group, and the ADL disability group. And if you look at the graph for the ADL disability in the 60-year-olds, you'll see that it looks somewhat similar to the no disability graph in the 80-year-olds. And we think that you can get an enormous amount of information about the kinds of activities people are participating in, about the total volume of activity, about the distribution of those activities over the course of the day. And we're looking for small clinical trials where we might be able to carry out this idea. I think that the trial that Dr. Morley mentioned from Dr. Singh would be an ideal opportunity, because we could look at how this measurement works similarly to the other measurements of performance that have been used, and hopefully think about having this accepted as an outcome for a clinical trial. You can now get up to 30 days of activity on some of the memory chips for these sensors. So in closing, I just want to thank my collaborators who have contributed a great deal to my thinking and the general thinking about about activity, and also about Sarcopenia and Health ABC. And I'd like to close there. Thank you very much.
Very much fascinating talk. Can you remind me, how did you measure lean muscle mass in this work, and is there room for improvement that might reveal correlations not seen in the current methods?
No, I'm sorry, I should have said that. We use dual energy X-ray optical geometry. We had the Logic 4500A machines, and we also had 5CT. And I've done some previous analysis, which I haven't published, unfortunately, but that previous analysis didn't show association. It showed also looking cross-sectionally, and then looking at year 6 didn't show functional associations with low lean mass. I think low lean mass probably may mean something different in relatively healthy populations than it means in people who are cachectic or under major stressors. I think that we might want to think about them in 2 different ways, just the way that Dr. Bellis mentioned.
I mean, as usual, that was a brilliant, methodical presentation. But does change in lean mass, did you try to change over time in lean mass to how the parameters of the model check? Because I can imagine the people who are always thin, and like my son has small muscles, he will all of his life, and someone's going to call him sarcopenic someday. But will only be true if he's actually lost. Lost maybe rapidly.
I think that I want to continue to work on these data, because I was surprised about the low lean mass myself. And I can tell you that I did look at percent weight change from age 50. We have a reported weight at age 50 to baseline, and it turned out that the people who were had low lean mass had a greater chance of having lost weight, whereas the people that predicted sarcopenia, but the gain in weight predicted frailty. So these are people who I think that we have to realize the older population is very heterogeneous. Just like Bruno was talking about at least the 3 groups, very heterogeneous people are moving in different directions within this population. And the low lean mass group is picking out one group that may be at risk under certain circumstances. But people who are heavy go on to lose weight quickly when they're under stress. And that group is also at high risk.
Did you evaluate which of the frailty defining criteria seemed to drive the relationship? Was there a predominance of one of the criteria versus others?
I think that's a great idea, and I didn't get to do that yet.
Thank you very much.
Well, to make this complicated, I am familiar with studying all the time.
The-
Slight differences, but they're...
John some of the measures that are used in frailty have much greater precision than other ones. And particularly, I think the index of fatigue, which is